My father was Professor John Zachary Young. I'm speaking to you from Somerset in the UK. I'm going to show you some old films of him and his work and read you some of his words from an unfinished autobiography, and then tell you a bit about how it was to be his daughter in Naples. He first visited his beloved Naples following the completion of his undergraduate degree in zoology at Magdalen College, Oxford. Here he is dissecting the giant nerve fibre of the squid, the discovery for which he is most widely remembered.
Professor J.Z. Young began his detailed studies of the squid's nervous system in 1933. Opening the mantle cavity in the mid-ventral line exposes the squid's true body wall, through which the viscera can be seen. The muscular siphon itself, and on each side, close to the inhalant openings of the mantle cavity, a large ganglion. This is called the stellate ganglion, and when the gill is removed, the reason is clear. Numerous nerves just below the skin radiate from it in a star-like pattern. Professor Young showed that each stellate ganglion has about 10 of these nerves, and that they fan out to all parts of the mantle wall. He also showed that each of these stellar nerves contained a large transparent tubular structure, about 1 millimeter in diameter, which Young at first took to be a blood vessel. In transverse sections, though, he found that this structure was, apart from its size, little different from the numerous small nerve fibers which surrounded it. Moreover, unlike a small arteriole, it never contained blood or amoebocytes. Examination of the stellate ganglion, particularly in the small transparent squid Alloteuthis, showed that all these tubular structures arose within the ganglion itself. Closer examination of the dissected ganglion confirmed this, and detailed studies of its histology convinced Young in 1936 that each of these tubular structures must be a single nerve fibre, a giant axon formed by the fusion of very many smaller ones. Young confirmed this hypothesis when, using a pair of simple electrodes, he stimulated a stellar nerve. Large contractions of that part of the mantle served by the stellar nerve were only obtained if the tubular structure within it remained intact. These structures, therefore, must be single nerve axons, each almost 1 millimeter in diameter.
This is a piece from an autobiography that my father was writing in 1992, and the images of Naples that you can see are mostly from the 1950s. He describes publishing his first paper in Italian, at which time he would have been 22 years old. My early knowledge of the nervous system came largely from Derek Denny Brown, who was a Rhodes Scholar at Magdalen. He taught me how to do the silver stains, and through him I came to meet Jack Eccles and others working with Sherrington in the physiology department. The Stazione Zoologica was an excellent place to work on marine animals. The fauna and flora is rich, and in those days there were collectors who knew where to find whatever was wanted. The director, Reinhard Dorn, was most welcoming, and I soon met visitors from all over the world. I had a room at the top of the building looking out over the sea to Capri. There were wonderful trips through the green Campi Flegrei and their volcanic rocks. In 1929 there was an eruption of Vesuvius, and I walked with 2 friends right to the top at night, although it was forbidden at the time. We reached the edge of the crater at dawn, and it was a wonderful sight, with the flames in front and the sun rising behind. Hot rocks fell around us, and I said, "I'm off," but my friend called out that it was no worse than the shelling during the war, and much more beautiful. The work I did in Naples during 1928 to 1929 laid the foundation for much of my scientific lifetime insofar as it dealt with nerves of fishes and octopuses. At that time, however, I did not yet deal with the topics that concerned me later, neither with nervous conduction nor memory. Continuing my interest in the autonomic nervous system of fishes, I looked for a bony fish in which I could describe the sympathetic nerves as I had done in the dogfish. I was lucky to come upon the little stargazer or anglerfish, Uranoscopus. This lies hidden in the sand and has no air bladder, and therefore its sympathetic system is laid out in a manner that is easy to study. Uranoscopus is also unusual in that its iris changes diameter very greatly. It uses its eyes to watch for any prey that responds to the pink lure that waves out of its mouth, so there has to be rapid accommodation as a prelude to the snap of the jaws. The pupil thus varies greatly, unlike the usual fish eye with its almost fixed pupil. It occurred to me to test whether this pupillary response of Uranoscopus was produced by the sympathetic nerves. Electric stimulation showed that these nerves, in fact, constrict the pupil, the opposite response to that in a mammal. I later confirmed this also at Plymouth in another anglerfish, Lophius. This is an interesting case of convergence, but the significance of this strange difference between irises of fishes and mammals has never been elucidated, though the facts have been confirmed. The next research interest that came into my life in that year was the nerves of octopus, stimulated by Enrico Sereni. He was in charge of the physiology department at the Stazione Zoologica and was making a study of the salivary glands and chromatophores of cephalopods. I do not recall exactly how we came to undertake a study of regeneration of the nerves of octopus. Possibly he had considered their suitability and was attracted by the histological methods that I could bring to them. It proved to be a most rewarding investigation, one of the earliest and I think most thorough of nerve regeneration that has been made in an invertebrate. Through Sereni, I met several scientists and I quickly learned to speak Italian and made expeditions with them all around Naples and the islands. I lived in the Pensione Alexandra House on the Via Caracciolo, which was run by an English family of a man who had originally come to work as an engineer at the Vickers Steelworks in Pozzuoli. Experience of the octopus led far beyond the regeneration of its nerves, ultimately to the giant fibres of the squid and to memory. But in that first year, the only step was prompted by curiosity as to a small orange spot to be seen at the hind end of the stellate ganglion of Eledini. Sections showed a sac with what seemed to be nerve cells sending processes to end blindly at the centre. With my interest in the adrenal gland, I guessed that these might be secretory. I christened the object the epistellar body, and it was the subject of my first paper, Sopra un nuovo organi dei cefalopodi, read at a meeting in the summer of 1929. At the same time, I also wrote a note on regeneration of the nerves of octopus. My presentation of these papers was evidently not good. "Why didn't you give them in English?" was one comment. The further history of the epistellar body is quite bizarre. First, it was seized upon by Ernst Schiaveri as an example to support his concept of neurosecretion. I was never happy with this because I consider that it does not help to place biological processes in sharply distinct categories. Indeed, we now see that chemical transmission is a very general phenomenon. Identification of neurosecretory organs may well have hindered the understanding rather than helping it. In any case, the epistellar body is not a neurosecretory organ. 50 years later, Howard Byrne and his colleagues investigated it by electron microscopy and found that the processes are rhabdons, photoreceptors. The organ is a sort of eye without a lens. Alex Mauro was able to show that it gives electrical potential upon illumination. Its function in octopus remains a mystery. Looking inwards to the mantle. One theory is that it detects luminous material in the water, which could be dangerous if the mantle was transparent, as it is in newly hatched octopuses and some deep-sea forms where the epistellar body is large. In decapods such as squids and cuttlefishes, there is no epistellar body, but similar sacs filled with photoreceptors are found in the head. These extraocular photoreceptors are now all classed together as photosensitive vesicles. They may be considered as analogues of the vertebrate pineal eyes that do not see. serving to measure the light intensity but not to construct an image. Those in the head had proved easier to study than the epistella, and they vary greatly in squids that live at different depths. Richard Young, not a relation, of Hawaii, had made a detailed study of their size in various species. With Clyde Roper, he has shown that in squids such as Abrolia that live in moderate depths, they serve to regulate the output of the animal's own luminar organs, by which it conceals itself by counter-illumination. The vesicles are divided into two sets. One lot directed upwards detects the downwelling light, and the other set measures the light emitted by the animal's own photophores. In this way, the light can be so regulated that the squid cannot be seen by a predator attacking from below. The control is so precise that the light emitted matches that of the sky in wavelength intensity, even in moonlight, producing effective counter-illumination under varied conditions. In squids that breed at very great depth, there is no light from above and no counter-illumination is needed, but the photosensitive vesicles are very large and contain masses of long rhabdons, which must make them sensitive to even the faintest gleam of light. Probably, they are responsible for ensuring that as the animal matures, it proceeds deeper and deeper until no further light is detectable, and then it is time to breed. It is hard to prove this, and the vesicles may serve other functions, perhaps to detect other luminescent organisms, whether predator or prey. The most dramatic outcome of my curiosity about the orange spot on the stellate ganglion was the discovery of the giant nerve fibres of the squid. Having examined the epistellar body of various species of octopus, I naturally proceeded to look for it in cuttlefishes and squids, but no such sac was to be found. Instead, at the hind end of the stellate ganglion of Loligo, there's a mass of small cells, and within the ganglion itself and in the nerves arising from it, my sections showed large channels which at first I took to be blood vessels. It was a long time before I realized that they are in fact huge nerve fibers, nearly 1 millimeter in diameter in the large squid. Part of the difficulty of recognizing their nervous nature is that they do not arise from a giant nerve cell. They are produced by a fusion of axons in the many small cells at the back of the ganglion. Thus, as you trace one of the channels in a stellar nerve back to the ganglion, it divides up into many smaller channels. I do not have a record of when exactly I realized that they are giant nerve fibers. However, in my collection there is a slide with a thick section of a squid stellate ganglion which clearly shows the course of a giant fiber. The label carries the date, April 1930, and I must have realized the true situation by then. However, it was a long time before I felt sure enough to publish anything about the fibers. Their potential importance for research on the nature of the nerve impulse only dawned on me gradually during the year after I returned from Naples and came into contact with Eccles and others in the physiology department. Complications appeared as I looked at the nerves of cuttlefishes where giant fibers are smaller and do not arise from a single fiber lobe. My own first published note about the giant nerve fibers was in the Journal of Physiology of 1933. Calling attention to the fact that the contents of the flow out of a cut end, which I concluded to be evidence that the axoplasm is fluid. We now know that is wrong. It only becomes liquid when it is in contact with seawater. The first detailed account of the fibres in the squid was in the Quarterly Journal of Microscopical Science in 1934, when I suggested that the epistellar body of octopods was derived from giant fibre lobe of decapods, which almost certainly is another mistake. The proof that these are in fact very large nerve fibres came only in 1936 in Woods Hole in America. The full description of the giant fibres of Loligo was not produced until 1939. As I traced out all the connections of the fibres, I realized that nerve fibres may fuse completely and therefore always act together, if this is required by their function. I traced the giant fibre system back from the mantle and the stellate ganglion to 2 single giant cells in the brain. These had been repeated long before by Williams in 1906, But I did not know of this at the time, and since there seems to have been no further reference to these large cells in the literature, Williams believed that the axons of these cells ran right through the stellar nerves, though he did not give any description of the later part of the system. Thus he discovered the giant cells, but did not describe the giant fibres. Here is the man himself at work in the 1980s, with a fixed camera over the microscope.
Dorsal retractor, pulling on helmet. The strange thing is that this is stimulation of the salivary papilla. Not stimulation of the nerve, as I would have thought it.
And is your microganglion present?
Well, that's what I can't make out. How it's stimulated.
Oh, look, it's reflecting.
Hey!
Very strong.
Yes. Now, as you say, the problem is to know what is good and what's bad.
That's the papilla, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Large.
The neurology of that we don't understand.
Did you know that before?
No.
That's stimulating the back of the papilla, is it?
The cell.
Salivary.
It injects a poison. You see that? Below the
Yes. It's all been mucky, that electrode, by the way.
Fully opened out now. Holding bending plane. Transverse muscle between the two sides. No attachment. Bolsters.
Così.
Sì. Si vede che il muscolo che
Un muscolo che si apre, sì.
no, si preme.
Si prende, si
Sì, perché è molto strano. Perché i muscoli di solito soltanto si accocciano. Invece questo è un grande.
Si è aperto.
Sì, perché le fibre vanno così. Bene.
Buona giornata.
No, buongiorno. Come? Io posso venire? Sì, posso venire? Dorso. Cioè. Left goes pushing. Radula now cut away. Move forward, leaving two bolsters here, joined by the transverse muscle. Stimulating left bolster, push it. Stimulating gang. Both push. Dorsal muscle trap. Stimulating inferior buccal gang. Right? On the left. Dorsal retractor muscle.
Like definitely moving out the other side when you do that. Comes flat though. It isn't because you're pushing it.
Oh,
Quite it's very interesting.
the subject moving too. One more from this side, two. Pushing up. Pushing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now it's come back to relaxed. Oh yeah, it's coming right out there.
Stimulating the contracting muscle.
Could you stimulate this where it doesn't look as if you're pulling it?
What to do. There.
Oh, that's going back now. That's opening up the helmet.
That's right.
Should get a bit better centered though.
No, I think it's enough. Well, start.
Yeah. I see. Now this is at the back end of it.
I'm trying to stimulate the
Yes. So there it is. It's opening now. It's widely open now. Yes.
Showing all right?
Yes. Saying all right.
Show me from this.
Yes. Yes.
On.
Same voltage 50 a second. Off.
Now for another excerpt from the autobiography about his appointment to the anatomy department at UCL. My father was not an MD, nor did he have a PhD, therefore he was never Dr. Young, but he was appointed to lead a department that taught medical doctors. He says, "My appointment was a great surprise to the medical profession. A number of distinguished teachers wrote to the Lancet to deplore this lapse from medical professionalism. Many of the signatories have admitted to me since that they were wrong. The other professors of anatomy all received me generously, and I was a happy member of the Anatomical Society, and now an honorary member. An interesting epilogue is that not only my successor at UCL, but all the professors of anatomy at Oxford and Cambridge and are all my former students. And none of them is medically qualified, and all are fellows of the Royal Society. Later generations arose from the students who we taught by giving them an extra year and a Bachelor of Science degree. The introduction of this was a major change that I brought about. At Oxford and Cambridge, all medical school students were given a good scientific education, but at the medical schools in London and elsewhere, they had only 3 years of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry and pharmacology. A very few took a 4th year in physiology. I now introduced a BSc special course in anatomy, aimed not only at the very few who were likely to do research later, but at the more ambitious medical students. The course developed through the years, including much cell biology and embryology, giving students experience of handling living tissue and often collaborating with members of staff in research. It proved to be very popular. 8 or 9 students did it every year. The practice spread to other departments at University College and to other medical schools. It was strongly supported by grants from the Medical Research Council for students for an extra year. Clinical teachers found that those who had been through such courses were better able to understand modern medical methods, an advantage previously given only to those at Oxford and Cambridge. Teaching the BSc students was more like the teaching I had been familiar with at Oxford. We gave them tutorials and they wrote essays, not as regularly nor as often as I should have liked, and they were mostly taught by other members of staff, so I'm afraid my influence was largely indirect. I did get to know them individually, however, because we took many of them to Naples to help with the training of octopuses there. Thanks to the grants that I had from the American Air Force and later from the Science Research Council, I was able to have 4 students at work in Naples at a time, and they usually came in 2 groups for 6 weeks each. This gave them several sorts of experience of travel, of Italy, and of research with live animals. It gave me a chance to get to know them well. Altogether, over a period of 20 years, about 200 BSc students came to Naples. I'm now going to play a short excerpt from the Baylis-Starling lecture, which my father gave in 1988.
So we've got a system exactly like the vertebrate semicircular canals, but with, in this case, 4 parts to it. And the question is, how is the sensitivity adjusted to the movements of the squids, which are much faster than those of the octopus? Well, we don't know the full answer. But a very interesting factor, which I've been working at for some time recently, is the shape of the whole system. It's not square like this. Have the next slide, please. But has a most extraordinary shape. And for the horizontal flow of endolymph, it is organized into a sort of canal. The sac is shaped by the cartilage wall to make a canal like this. This is the vertical crista. That's the crista coming up. We're looking at this from above. And here is the horizontal canal, which monitors turning to the right in this case. Well, it doesn't matter which side, the right or left. Because the flow will be round here and will go across the cupula of the vertical crista like that. The interesting thing about the squids, though, is that they've made a canal of a sort, but they haven't made it in the same way as we make our canals. They've shaped it on the outside, and then they've filled up the middle with these projections. These are cartilaginous projections, which we call anticristi. And the anticristi serve to make a canal. But you'll see, though it makes quite a good canal for the horizontal flow, there's not such perfect canals for the other directions. This is the crista here. So for the anterior part, the lateral part, and the posterior part, you can see there is not a perfect canal. Now, we, of course, have got 3 good canals, but then we don't move our heads, we don't stimulate them separately. Any movement of the head stimulates all 3 canals. And we then unite the information in the central nervous system. The squids don't bother to have 3 equal canals, they differentiate. They have a very good canal for the yawing plane, which of course is the one in which most rapid turns take place, rather less perfect canals for the rolling plane or the pitching plane. At least that's what it seems to be. The next ones will show us something of the details of this. Next one, oh, here we are. Here's this canal. This is the jumbo squid, Basilicus of the Pacific, where the biggest of all giant nerve fibers come from, incidentally. And he is a very active mover. He is sometimes the flying squids. They come right out of the water. They move at tremendous speed. And you see, he's got really quite a good canal. I admit this is a drawing. Perhaps will raise your skepticism. But I can assure you it's a very good canal made by these anticristi knobs of cartilage. But in the front end, you see, there isn't such a good system of canals for the anterior or rolling part of the system. Next one, please. And here's this is the ordinary common or garden squid, loligo. And just to show you, this is seen now from the side. And so here's the horizontal canal, goes round like this. Get it? Round like this. I've shown it here. That's the cupula, rather shrunken, not very well preserved. I'm afraid they're very difficult to preserve. That's so, of course, in all animals, so in vertebrates too. Cupulae are very delicate structures, and they are difficult to preserve. But you can see how the flow coming around here will stimulate it. And it's restricted by these knobs, the anticristi, here and here. Next one, please. And here again in a squid, these knobs have actually fused. They fuse in an adult squid, they're separate in a baby, and that's the canal which goes round. Well, how does this work? Clearly, it's got some analogy with the semicircular canals. And I would like to press the analogy quite a long way. Linda Maddock and I have measured the statocysts of a great many animals of various species and different ages. And we find that, as invertebrates, they have a very characteristic relationship to the size of the whole animal. The semicircular canals are very small. The canals in man are only about twice the size they are in a mouse. In order to monitor the speed of angular acceleration which vertebrates have, they need to have these very small canals, and they grow very slowly. Well, I hope you found that these various examples of eyes and statocysts and photosensitive vesicles are of some interest. For me, each one of them is a wonder. I long to find out more about how they have come to have their function and how they are working today. To conclude, I'd like to quote you Professor Bayliss' preface to the first edition of his Principles of General Physiology. He quoted St. Paul's epistle to the Thessalonians, a well-known quotation: "Prove all things and hold fast to that which is good." But he didn't leave it at that. The Greek word for good is kali, which also means beautiful. And as he says, all science should be kali, and not, as so many people say today, essentially ugly, though possibly necessary. Like the Greeks, we should look upon all that is true as both beautiful and good. Thank you.
When I was born in 1959, JZ was going to the Stazione Zoologica every summer with students, as mentioned. My father was always interested in drawing these impressionable and intelligent young people away from medicine into what he saw as a more interesting and valuable work of a research biologist. He achieved this with more than a few. The anatomy students were the workforce he trained up to carry out the experiments. The octopuses were brought into us by local fishermen for whom my father had huge respect. You could see the buckets being carried past the children playing outside in the Villa Comunale. The numbers of animals in the rather makeshift laboratory at the Stazione were quite large. Each trial involved up to 30 octopuses, and there were usually 3 or 4 experiments running at a time. My father was seldom the only researcher using the facilities, and he worked alongside and with many others. These scientists and their children were the companions of all my childhood summers. Octopuses can squeeze through a ridiculously small gap, as the only solid part of their bodies is their beak or radula. Many different tank-closing devices were developed over the years. The ones in my day folded out in 3 sections with 2 handles at each end, which were turned to lock them. These relatively successful tank lids were the culmination of a series of designs by my father to outwit the extraordinarily supple octopuses from escaping with a splat onto the terracotta tiles. An octopus can survive out of water for some considerable time, but it happened that missing individuals remained undiscovered in corners until their smell assisted our search, long after it was too late to save them. That smell is not easy to forget. This was of interest to the many generations of feral cats living in and out of the green railings and around the legs of the tanks. The cartoon by Martin Wells describes the situation as he saw it, probably before my time, when my mother and Martin are drinking in the distance in a room beyond, and my father's getting on with the work, and tanks are not even covered and octopuses are climbing out. Octopuses were trained to respond to a visual stimulus or touch stimulus. I still have some of the Perspex balls that my father designed and had made specifically for the touch training. These have got 3 rings and 2 rings, so they would have been, well, a little bit rough. I think he found that the balls with the 13 rings was more normal, and plain, you could get a more distinctive result. They're on a piece of fishing line that's about 1.5 foot long, half a metre long, and we dangle them into the tank, and the octopus would stretch out its tentacle and take it into its mantle, and that would be a take. Or sometimes we dangle into the tank and the octopus would squirt it away because they'd learned so well that this was the thing they were going to get an electric shock from. When my father retired in 1975, I was in my teens and the supply of BSc students dried up. However, he carried on work without a pause. The workforce now consisted of myself and others drafted in. My cousin Roger Young was one of the first non-BSc student groups. Then the following year, my great friend Sarah Welsh and her entire family of 6 came for the whole summer. I'm still in touch with them, and it is a testament to the communication tentacles that they still speak of the impact of those weeks on their now 60-year-old lives. My nephew Rupert Barrow, grandson of JZ's first wife Phyllis, also came to help with the work in the 1980s. In their individual tanks, octopuses would be trained. They were rewarded if, for example, they took the rough ball, or given an electric shock punishment if they took the smooth one. The rewards took the form of a little bit of sardine cut up into centimetre squares. Crabs were reserved for special occasions. The octopuses were then operated on and part of the brain removed. This was followed by more testing with the shapes to see if they could still remember what they had learned previously. Thus my father was able to understand and map the functions of the different parts of the brain of the octopus. I was in charge of preparing the octopuses for my father to operate on. I was the chief anaesthetist, and by the age of 15 I had become quite expert at catching the octopus, wrestling it into a square plastic container with the anaesthetic, urethane, mixed by me to the correct proportions. After an appropriate amount of time, I extracted the unconscious octopus, rinsed it with seawater, and propped it up on a cork on a specially designed wax tray wrapped in a damp cloth with exactly the right part visible for my father to operate on. After he'd carried out the operation, which took a few minutes, I would have my patient back and resuscitate it, using the piped salty seawater squirted under its mantle. I can still feel the position in which I held the octopus to return it to life, and the relief when this was achieved. The worst bit of the summer was when the time came to end the experiments. My father always did all the killing himself, and he hated it. He respected the animals enormously, and I wonder what he would have thought of the more recent insights into the intelligence of octopuses. My father continued work right up to the last weeks of his 90 years, not having any truck with his retirement lark. The last book that he wrote was with Marion Nixon, The Brains and Lives of Cephalopods, which was published in 2003, 6 years after his death. One of his last trips to Naples was to receive an honorary citizenship of the city in 1991. He was very proud to receive this honour. I accompanied him and Ray for his very last trip, and we were all greeted as old friends, of course at the Stazione Zoologica, but also at Tonino's, the bar where we spent most evenings drinking fantastically cheap wine and playing lyre dice, and of course the much more upmarket Bersagliera restaurant on the seafront at Santa Lucia. The very elderly head waiter there was a boy in his teens when JZ first started going to Naples. Many of the photographs here, and others that I did not include, were taken at the Bersagliera. Indeed, I was given the envelope with my A-level results in it there. My father married 2 artists, Phyllis, mother of Simon and Cordelia, and then my mother Ray, who painted and drew, especially when she was in Naples. She also found time to help with the experiments, make lunch for us all, to take to the beach, often including all 4 students. We would squeeze into our Ford Cortina estate, sometimes up to 9 of us at once, and drive over Posillipo to Mare Chiaro, or sometimes further out to one of the other wonderful places to swim or see. Since Ray only started driving in her 50s, my father then was seldom allowed behind the wheel. He got his license before you had to take a test. She loved everything about Naples, but especially the anarchic way that people treated cars. I can just remember coming down Vesuvius once with a full carload, and the brakes failed. She often created art inspired by the lovely images that came through the work. We have one hanging in our house now. At home, Ray made jewellery. She made a wonderful silver bowl with an octopus on it that they gave to Magdalen College. She often wore a bracelet that she had made, which is a fantastic celebration of all things cephalopod and marine. I'm wearing a pendant of an octopus that she made. And these aren't actually hers, but somebody gave me squid earrings for the observant of you. John spoke Italian and Neapolitan, an important distinction. Ray learned her Italian from this mixture, and I learnt mine from hers, never very successfully, therefore. Here's a picture of JZ at his 90th birthday at Magdalen College, which would have been 3-4 months before he died. Growing up, I was torn between the arts and the sciences, and I did a degree in zoology, but the arts side of my genes won in the long term, and I now run an artist studio project where I'm speaking to you from. in a building that we bought in 2005 and restored from a ruin. Our 3 sons are all involved in the arts. They also love their grandfather's honorary city. My father's career involved so many people and lifetimes. I have enormous affection for them all, and I love to think of him making his explorations and setting off on his many journeys in London and in Naples.